Before my only daughter was set to walk down the aisle, I stopped into a custom suit shop in downtown Houston for a final fitting. Without any warning at all, the owner, a man I'd trusted for the better part of 30 years, seized my arm, pulled me into a pitch-black fitting room, and whispered, "There are things you need to know. Stay here. Do not say a word. Trust me." I had no idea what was happening, but I held my tongue. A few minutes passed, and then the voices drifting through that thin mahogany paneling stopped me. Cold rooted me right there in the dark, the blood draining straight out of me. "My name is Gerald Hartwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, 4 decades spent raising commercial skyscrapers across Texas. I can read a hairline crack in a foundation long before any wall comes down. But Lord forgive me, I missed the fatal fracture running through my own family. Didn't see it until I was standing in that lightless room, hearing my future son-in-law quietly and calmly making plans to kill my only child. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days out from the wedding. My daughter Nora was everything to me, the whole center of my world. After my wife Helen died 7 years ago, Nora was the only thing I had left. She was 32, running her own art gallery, and lit up from the inside with happiness. She was engaged to Sutton Crane. Sutton was 35, flashy, the type who cruised around in a Japanese luxury coupe and draped himself in expensive designer clothes. Welcome to Dadrevenge. I'm glad you're here. Settle in, because the story you're about to hear is one I lived, and it changed everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and just how far a father will go. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close, there are more coming, and you won't want to miss them. Before we get into it, I'd love to know, what's the weather like where you're sitting right now? There's something about a stormy evening that makes a story like this one hit a little differently. One quick note before we begin: some details and dialogue have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. He presented himself as a wealthy tech investor out of the East Coast. That silver tongue of his felt a little too polished, too rehearsed, but Nora looked at him like he'd personally hung every star in the sky. When you're a father watching your daughter glow like that, you swallow your doubts. You want to believe the man is worth her. I was footing the entire bill for the wedding at an exclusive country club because giving her the world was the least she deserved. That Tuesday I drove out to Enzo Battista's tailor shop downtown. Enzo is a master craftsman and one of the closest friends I've kept for 25 years. The moment I pushed through the glass doors, the silver wind chime rang, and Enzo lifted his eyes from a heavy bolt of dark silk, and every drop of color left his face. He rushed toward me, flipped the sign to closed, and threw the deadbolt. Before I could get a single word out, he locked both hands on my shoulders and steered me hard toward the back of the shop. He pushed me into the deepest VIP fitting room, the one with thick velvet curtains and solid mahogany walls. He looked straight into my eyes, his hands trembling against my arms, and told me to stay in the dark. Not one sound, no matter what came through those walls. Then he shut the door and locked it from the outside. I was livid, completely disoriented. I nearly put my fists through the paneling, certain my old friend had gone off the deep end. Then I heard the front lock turn. The silver wind chime rang again. Hard-soled footsteps rang out across the hardwood. 2 sets of shoes. I knew the voices the instant they reached me. Sutton, my future son-in-law, and Claudia. Claudia was Sutton's older sister and his supposed business partner. She had arrived in town a week earlier, supposedly there to help pull the wedding together. They walked straight past my fitting room and settled into the lounge just beyond it. Nothing between us but an inch of decorative wood paneling. I stood there in the pitch dark, not breathing, waiting to understand why Enzo had locked me away like a fugitive. My mind went to minor things. Maybe Sutton was stretched thin financially, or nursing some small social secret he didn't want reaching me. I was a practical man. I could solve problems. What I could not do, what I was in no way ready for, was pure, calculated evil. Sutton spoke first. Gone was every trace of the charming, respectful tone he used around me and Nora. In its place was a low, arrogant laugh that curdled something deep in my gut. He told Claudia they weren't there for fabric swatches. He said the old man hasn't got a clue that I'd signed the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it was nothing more than a standard trust setup to avoid taxes. I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood, my whole face tightening in the dark. We had spoken about a family trust to protect Nora's inheritance, yes, but a medical power of attorney had never been any part of that conversation. Why would Sutton need legal authority over Nora's medical decisions? Claudia answered him, her voice cold and precise as a blade. She told him that was very good. As soon as the ink dries on that document, she said, the $10 million life insurance policy becomes completely active. And then she said the words that stopped my heart dead in my chest. Nora will not survive the hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. It is a tragic accident waiting to happen, and you will be the grieving widower holding all the cards. Sutton laughed again, low, satisfied, sickening. He called it a brilliant plan. The air in my lungs went heavy as ash. My legs nearly buckled right there in the dark. My mind snapped back to the honeymoon itinerary. Sutton had pushed relentlessly to book a remote, high-altitude hiking excursion deep in Switzerland, selling it as some grand, romantic adventure. My Nora, who loathed the cold and had never set foot on a mountain trail, had gone along with it just to make him happy. He was going to push her off a cliff, and he needed my signature first, so that when they wheeled her into a foreign hospital on life support, I'd have no legal standing to intervene. They stayed another 5 long minutes in that shop, calmly talking through the fastest way to liquidate my commercial real estate holdings once they had full control of my daughter's estate. Every word they spoke landed like a sledgehammer on the foundation of everything I had built. I did not move. I did not breathe. I let that lightless room absorb the first wave of shock and watched it harden into something pure, cold, absolute rage. Then I heard the shop door chime as they stepped back out into the afternoon. Enzo unlocked my door immediately. He was drenched in sweat, his face a mixture of pity and dread. I didn't say anything. I reached out, gripped his shoulder, my one gesture of gratitude, and walked straight out the front. I got into my truck and wrapped both hands around the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I put my boot down on the gas. I did not call the police. I had no recording, no proof, just my word against theirs. And I knew Nora was completely under his spell. I drove hard through Houston traffic toward my daughter's building, the rage in my chest alive and expanding like something with its own heartbeat. I was going to take her front door off its hinges. I was going to break Sutton apart piece by piece until he said every last word out loud. To any parent hearing this, never let the fear of damaging your relationship stop you from acting on what your gut is screaming at you. Predators don't arrive with warning labels. They show up looking exactly like everything your child ever dreamed of. They use charm as a weapon and distance as a slow poison. When someone enters your family and the whole atmosphere quietly shifts, when your child starts pulling away from you, don't step back politely. Push forward. Ask the questions that make everyone uncomfortable. Build your case in the shadows. Being the villain in their eyes for a single month beats mourning them for the rest of your life. I pulled up to the curb and left the truck in a fire lane. My boots hit the lobby floor hard as I brushed past the concierge without a word. I rode the elevator straight up and hit the button for the penthouse. My chest was heaving by the time the doors opened. I didn't knock. I drove the oak door open so hard it cracked against the wall. Nora gasped and scattered a stack of wedding invitations across the floor. Sutton was on the leather sofa sipping a glass of still water, completely composed. No flinch, no jump. He just turned those flat, cold eyes on me, the eyes of something that calculates rather than feels. I crossed the room in 3 strides. I got my finger in his face and told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I demanded answers about the medical power of attorney. I demanded answers about the $10 million life insurance policy and that hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. I turned to Nora and told her to get away from him, that he and his so-called sister, Claudia, were plotting to kill her. I expected him to stammer, to snap, to come at me across the living room. Instead, Sutton did the one thing that frightened me most. He exhaled slowly, set his glass on the table, and turned to Nora with an expression of deep, wounded patience. He rose to his feet with his hands open, every gesture calibrated to read as calm and reasonable. When he spoke, his voice was so perfectly controlled, it made my skin crawl. He addressed my accusations with something that sounded almost like concern, completely sidestepping my fury. He crossed to his leather briefcase on the counter and produced a thick sheaf of legal documents. He spread them across the kitchen island, smoothing the pages flat with those manicured hands. He touched Nora's arm gently, then looked at me and began to explain, with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment, that the trust paperwork was standard practice for high-net-worth couples entering a marriage. He said that given my commercial real estate holdings in Houston, Nora was staring down a serious tax exposure. He tossed around talk of the 40% U.S. estate tax with the fluency of a seasoned corporate attorney. As for the medical power of attorney, he said it was just a standard legal rider the lawyers automatically attached, designed to protect Nora in the event something happened to me, not the other way around. He reshaped the entire story so smoothly that for one terrible half-second, I felt my own certainty waver. Then I brought up the $10 million life insurance policy. I said it out loud, premeditated murder. Sutton still didn't raise his voice. He reached back into the briefcase and laid a bank letter on the island. He explained, glancing at Nora with manufactured devotion, that the policy was a mandatory condition set by his private bank to secure financing on the Scottsdale mansion he was purchasing for their future. A financial safety net, he called it, so Nora would never be left underwater if something unexpected happened to him. He made it sound like an act of love. He framed it as the ultimate gesture of a devoted, providing husband. As for the Swiss Alps, he offered a soft smile and reminded Nora it was meant to be a surprise, a fully supervised, guided luxury tour with professional Sherpas, nothing remotely resembling a dangerous solo mountain climb. He played the wounded party with chilling precision. Those sorrowful eyes turned on me as he quietly asked why I despised him so deeply that I would conjure a murder plot just days before the happiest moment of their lives. I turned to my daughter, desperate for her to see past his polished surface. I tried to tell her about Enzo, about the tailor shop, about the conversation I had heard through that wall. But when I looked into Nora's eyes, the little girl I had raised and shielded was nowhere to be found. I was staring at a stranger sealed inside a carefully constructed illusion. Her face burned with anger, her hands shook, but every bit of that fury was directed at me. She moved squarely in front of Sutton, putting herself between him and my pointed finger. She told me I had completely lost my mind. Her voice cracked when she brought up her mother. She said that since Helen died 7 years ago, I had turned paranoid, suffocating, and controlling. She accused me of trying to destroy her happiness, because I could not bear the thought of facing old age alone. Each word landed like a blade, finding a different wound. I tried to get through to her, tried to describe the cold calculation in Claudia's voice, the pure malice I had absorbed through that wooden wall, but Nora threw her hand up and refused to hear another syllable. She said I had spent my whole life erecting cold, lifeless steel structures, and now I was trying to tear down the one beautiful thing she had ever built for herself. She wept openly, insisting that Sutton had done nothing but love and support her, while I stood there behaving like a paranoid old man set on wrecking her future. The anguish in her eyes cut me to the bone. A trembling finger rose towards the open doorway of the penthouse. She screamed that I was destroying her life and dismantling her wedding. She told me to go and not to return until I was ready to apologize and accept the man she loved. I stood there looking at both of them. Sutton folded her into his arms, pressing his lips to her head as she sobbed against his chest. Over her trembling shoulder, his eyes locked onto mine. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face, the unmistakable expression of a man who believes he has taken the opening round. I understood right then that confronting him out in the open would only drive Nora deeper into his trap. If I kept pushing, she would sever ties with me completely, and she would die on those frozen slopes. I turned and walked out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut at my back. I stood alone in the quiet, carpeted hallway, cut off from my only child. I had nothing the police would act on, no allies remaining anywhere in her life. But I knew the truth, the full, suffocating weight of it. If Sutton wanted to play a game of shadows to strip my legacy and destroy my daughter, he was about to find out exactly how relentless a father's love could make a man. I moved toward the elevator, already building a new strategy. I was going to dismantle his entire existence piece by careful piece, until there was nothing left anywhere for him to hide behind. I spent that night on my back, staring at the ceiling, forcing my wounded pride to yield to cold, clean logic. An engineer understands that a direct assault on a fortified wall only destroys your own tools. You have to locate the stress points first. And to do that, you need access. The following morning, I picked up my phone and did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I called my daughter and lied. I let my voice waver. I pushed out a trembling, fragile tone that made me sound much older than my years. I apologized in excess for my outburst. I blamed it on grief, told her that the thought of giving her away had cracked something open in me, triggered a panic attack that I couldn't control. I swallowed every last piece of my pride and asked for her forgiveness. Nora hesitated, her voice threaded with suspicion, but her heart is good by nature. She exhaled, her tone easing, and invited me to join them for Sunday brunch at the country club to clear the air. She mentioned that Sutton had encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her, set down the phone, and felt a cold iron resolve settle through me like poured concrete. Sunday arrived bright and blinding. I walked onto the country club patio in a tailored suit, wearing a perfectly assembled mask of contrition. Nora, Sutton, and Claudia were already seated at a table overlooking the 9th fairway. I came toward them with an apologetic bearing, playing the chastened elder statesman who had finally learned his place. Sutton rose to greet me, his expression radiating smug, magnanimous ease, the gracious winner accepting a surrender. He pulled out my chair and ordered me a coffee without being asked. Claudia sat across from him, sipping a Bloody Mary, her eyes tracing my every movement with quiet, calculating attention. I settled into my seat, spread my napkin, and completely rewired my approach. I stopped speaking and started watching. I switched off the part of my mind that wanted to reach across the table and take Sutton by the throat, and engaged the patient, analytical eye of an engineer. I began scanning their facade for hairline fractures. Sutton owned the conversation. He spoke at length about a privileged upbringing in Charleston, dropping the names of elite boarding schools and exclusive yacht clubs with the ease of long practice. His left arm rested on the white tablecloth, a gold vintage Breitling displayed prominently at his wrist. He caught me looking and offered that it was a family heirloom handed down from a grandfather who had been a titan of industry. a striking piece from a distance. But my eyes are trained to catch millimeter-level flaws in steel beams from 50 yards out. When he reached for his water glass and the light struck the watch face cleanly, I focused on the second hand. On a genuine vintage mechanical Breitling that second hand moves in one continuous sweeping arc. Sutton's did not sweep. It ticked one stiff, distinct jump per second. Quartz movement. A cheap, mass-produced mechanism encased in shiny gold. A counterfeit. Just like the man wearing it. A hairline crack had opened in the foundation. I filed it silently away and kept nodding along to his fabricated family history. A few minutes later, the waiter arrived with our plates. While adjusting my silverware, I let my cloth napkin slide deliberately off my lap. It dropped to the stone floor. I bent to retrieve it and stole a fraction of a second beneath the table. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Claudia, presented to the world as Sutton's older sister, had her heel slipped free from her shoe. Her bare foot was resting high on Sutton's inner thigh, her toes moving in slow, unmistakably intimate circles. No sister's gesture. They were entirely at ease, completely confident in their deception, certain the foolish old man across from them was too blind to see it. I sat back upright, held my face absolutely still, and felt my heart pound a hard and dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I moved my attention to Nora. For the full length of that brunch, my bright-spirited daughter had barely managed 3 sentences. She sat with her shoulders caved inward, posture collapsed. Her skin, usually warm and full of color, was pale and nearly translucent, carrying a sickly, washed-out quality. She stared at her untouched plate with hollow, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked about a refill, she blinked several times, as though processing the simple question required real effort. Sutton moved in immediately, a gentle, controlling hand settling over hers as he answered smoothly on her behalf. "Just tired from the wedding preparations," he said. She needed rest. Nora gave a slow, mechanical nod and let her head drop against his shoulder. The realization struck me like something solid. This was not fatigue. She had been stripped of her own will, kept wrapped in a fog. The voices from that fitting room came roaring back. They were medicating her, maintaining a chemical compliance that kept her from registering anything wrong, ensuring she would sign whatever document they placed in front of her without a moment's hesitation. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to stand up, overturn that table, and pull my daughter out of that club by force. I wanted to demand police call for a blood test on the spot, expose both of them to every person sitting in that dining room. But the engineer's mind clamped down hard before I could move. If I called the police at that exact moment, what would they actually have? Nothing I could prove. All I had was a counterfeit watch and a stolen glance beneath a table. Nora, dulled by whatever they were feeding her, would without question stand behind Sutton. The police would see nothing but a volatile family dispute, a father lobbing wild accusations at his daughter's devoted fiancé. They'd leave and Sutton would immediately understand how deep my suspicions ran. He would move faster. He would take Nora somewhere I couldn't follow, sever my access entirely, and carry out his murderous plan well beyond my reach. I understood then that acting on impulse would amount to signing my daughter's death warrant. Gut feelings and circumstantial glimpses wouldn't hold up to anything. I needed hard, irrefutable facts, bank records, toxicological reports, a documented trail of deception so airtight that no attorney, officer, or judge could dismiss it. I needed evidence capable of destroying him. I spent the rest of that brunch playing my part without a single slip. I smiled, laughed along at Sutton's hollow jokes, and kissed Nora's pale cheek when we said goodbye in the parking lot. I watched Sutton guide her toward his car, a counterfeit prince steering a captive princess into a trap he'd spent months engineering. I kept that soft, apologetic expression fixed in place and waved until their car disappeared around the bend. The moment they were out of sight, it dropped. I walked back to my truck, my mind already working through the geometry of their destruction. The game of shadows had begun, and I was going to reduce their world to rubble. First thing the following morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Houston. Plain jacket, baseball cap, head low, I bypassed the teller lines and went straight through. I walked directly to the private wealth management wing and sat down across from my personal banker. I told him I needed exactly $120,000 in untraceable cash. He looked at me with genuine unease, asking quietly whether I was in some kind of trouble. I offered a tired smile and said it was a highly confidential private investment. He didn't push any further. An hour later, I left that bank with a thick canvas duffel bag riding on my shoulder, the dense weight of bundled bills pressing against my ribs. From there, I headed to a nondescript office building out on the industrial edge of the city. I wasn't after an ordinary PI who frames cheating spouses through a telephoto lens. I needed a ghost, someone who worked entirely in shadow, someone who grasped the intricate machinery of financial fraud from the inside. I placed careful calls to old contacts, commercial construction men who had moved through worlds of corporate espionage, and every single one of them came back with the same name, Beckett Navar. Beckett was a former federal financial investigator who had been forced out of the agency a decade ago because his methods were too ruthless for the institution to absorb. He didn't concern himself with legal red tape. He cared about results. I walked into his sparely furnished office and placed the thick canvas duffel bag directly on his metal desk. I pulled the zipper back, exposing the stacked bills. Beckett barely registered it. He settled back in his creaking chair and asked me who we were dismantling today. I told him everything: the conversation through the wall in the tailor shop, the fake watch, the suspicious documents, the frightening state my daughter was in. Beckett took it all in without a sound, in that flat, calculating way of his. When I finished, he simply nodded, drew a clean notepad from his desk drawer, and told me we were going to account for every breath this man had ever taken. But before Beckett and I could make any move at all, I needed to build a massive diversion first. I needed Sutton feeling triumphant, relaxed, unguarded, convinced the danger had passed. I drove home, packed a golf bag, and called Nora with deliberate care. I made sure I was loading clubs into the trunk while I spoke, keeping my voice low and thoroughly beaten, the voice of a father who had finally surrendered. I told her the argument had rattled me to my core, that I'd been letting my grief over her mother corrupt the most important week of her life. I said I was flying down to a secluded golf resort in Florida to clear my head and steady myself so I could walk her down that aisle with something real on my face. Sutton was somewhere in the background. I heard him tell her to put me on speaker. He stepped into the call, his voice slicked over with warm, manufactured sympathy. He called it a fantastic idea and said Florida was exactly the thing. He promised he'd take perfect care of Nora while I was gone, telling me to work on my swing and let them handle whatever remained of the wedding planning. I forced down the bile, climbing my throat. I thanked him, told Nora I loved her more than anything in this world, and ended the call. Sutton believed he had successfully shipped the troublesome old man off to a golf course 1,000 miles away. He was fatally mistaken. I never went to Florida. I drove instead to a private airfield on the outskirts of Houston, where Beckett had already arranged a small, untraceable charter jet through a corporate shell account. We boarded without a word, 2 overnight bags and a pair of heavy laptops, nothing more. As the jet climbed and banked toward the East Coast, Beckett spread the wedding invitations Sutton had designed, with such obvious self-satisfaction across the fold-down table. Heavy, cream-colored cardstock, a polished family crest, an elegant return address. Sutton had never tired of boasting about his generational wealth, claiming his family's seat was a massive historic estate in one of the most exclusive old-money enclaves in Charleston. At dinner parties, he had spun lavish stories about a sprawling stone mansion, manicured grounds, rows of luxury cars. He said his parents were traveling through Europe and would fly directly into Houston just in time for the rehearsal dinner. It was a beautifully engineered fiction designed to make my daughter believe she was marrying into royalty. But as Beckett worked across his keyboard, navigating back doors, the federal government thought they had closed years ago. The cracks began to spread. Beckett surfaced property tax records, municipal utility bills, zoning filings. The Charleston address on those invitations did not belong to any Crane family. No record of a wealthy Crane family appeared anywhere in that prestigious zip code for the past 50 years. We landed in Charleston under a thick, overcast sky. The cold bit through my jacket the moment we stepped out, but I barely felt it. We collected a plain rental sedan and drove straight into the heart of the city. I held the wheel through the narrow, winding streets, watching the GPS close in on the address printed on those elegant invitations. My heart kept a hard, relentless beat the whole way. We turned off the main boulevard and descended into a declining industrial side street. The stately old homes with broad lawns fell behind us, fast replaced by cracked pavement and tall chain-link fencing. I brought the sedan to a slow halt at the precise coordinates Sutton had given the entire world. I put it in park and stared out through the windshield in complete suffocating disbelief. No stone mansion, no manicured grounds, no grand library, no sweeping entrance. The address belonged to a gutted, abandoned strip mall. Rotting plywood sealed the windows covered in layers of peeling graffiti and faded markings. The parking lot was a ruin of weed-cracked asphalt scattered with broken glass and rusted shopping carts. The specific unit number recorded as his family's historic estate was a small, ruined storefront, formerly a discount liquor shop, its faded awning bent so far it nearly touched the ground. Beckett sat still in the passenger seat, dark eyes fixed on the desolate scene. He closed his laptop slowly and looked directly at me. The silence inside that car pressed in from every side, thick with the full and terrifying scale of the lie we were staring at. Sutton was not a wealthy tech investor descended from old money. The man sleeping beside my heavily drugged daughter, the man systematically maneuvering to seize control of her entire life, did not actually exist. The wedding was a fiction, and Sutton Crane was an absolute ghost. Beckett didn't spend another second on the ruined building. He opened his laptop again, the pale glow of the screen cutting long shadows across his face. His fingers moved across the keys with a practiced, relentless precision. He bypassed the standard public record systems and went straight into municipal tax registries and property ownership archives. He connected the address of that abandoned liquor store to a network of obscure shell companies. The deception had been layered with surgical precision, engineered to defeat any routine background check. But Beckett Navar was no routine investigator. He was a predator in his own right, a man who made his living hunting financial criminals. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, listening to the rapid, steady rhythm of his keystrokes, my gaze fixed on the rotting plywood that sealed off the ruined storefront. The cold, damp Charleston air bled through the car windows, but a hot, suffocating fury was already burning from inside my chest. Beckett broke the quiet, his voice a low, measured hum. The shell company registered to this address was a dead end on paper. He said, but every shell company carries a registered agent and a bank routing number used to pay the minimum state filing fees. He fed that routing number into a specialized financial database and traced the origin of the funds. The screen filled with a cascading rush of banking records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts. It was an elaborate web of stolen money being funneled and recycled through a chain of dummy corporations. Beckett singled out a specific cluster of transactions. He walked me through how the funds were being methodically laundered and redirected into a high-yield checking account in Houston, Texas. That one account was the beating heart of his fabricated life. It covered the Japanese luxury coupe. It covered the tailored suits. It bankrolled the lavish dinners at five-star restaurants and sustained the illusion of a wildly successful tech investor. Every dollar propping up that glamorous existence had been violently extracted from the accounts of unsuspecting victims and routed through this crumbling strip mall. I sat there staring at the glowing monitor, watching digital figures representing millions in stolen money scroll across the screen. A wave of deep physical revulsion moved through me. I pressed my head against the cold car window and let my eyes fall shut. My mind pulled me back to the punishing, relentless heat of Texas summers. 4 decades of building the commercial real estate portfolio from nothing. Not a single inherited penny. I started as a junior structural engineer, steel-toed boots, and a hard hat, walking job sites, where the concrete was still wet and the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. I chose to work grueling 80-hour weeks, missing countless family dinners, school recitals, and weekend baseball games, because I was absolutely determined to lay an unbreakable foundation for my wife and my daughter. I remembered what it cost my body. The chronic ache in my lower back, the calluses on my palms that never fully faded, the countless nights hunched over the kitchen table wrestling with blueprints and supply chain budgets until the early hours. I poured my sweat and blood into Houston's soil to build something lasting, a legacy of security and dignity. I raised skyscrapers that pushed toward the cloud structures engineered to stand against the most brutal forces nature could throw at them. And I did every bit of it so Nora would never know the crushing weight of poverty or the sick, gnawing fear of not having enough. And now, sitting in this freezing rental car, I was staring at the precise opposite of everything I had ever stood for. He was a parasite, a hollow, empty vessel who had produced absolutely nothing of value. He did not build. He did not create. He simply found people who had spent their entire lives working hard, people who were trusting and dangerously vulnerable, and he systematically stripped their finances to the bone. He was trying to hijack 4 decades of my relentless sacrifice in a single overnight move. He wanted to seize the empire I had built for my daughter and spend it on his own pathetic criminal vanity. The sheer audacity of his parasitic existence made my blood run hot with a lethal intensity. I opened my eyes. The grief had burned away completely, leaving behind nothing but a cold, hardened resolve. I wasn't going to expose him. I was going to dismantle him utterly. Then Beckett let out a sharp, sudden breath. His keystrokes stopped cold. He leaned in toward the monitor, eyes narrowing as he parsed a newly decrypted file. The glow of the screen caught the shift in his face. The practiced, detached professionalism of the ex-federal investigator dissolved, replaced by something unmistakable, genuine, unguarded shock. He shook his head slowly, muttering that this man was remarkably sloppy for someone running a game with stakes this high. I demanded to know what he was looking at. I leaned over the center console, my eyes moving across the dense blocks of text on his screen. Beckett pulled up a digitized police record from a Nevada precinct more than a decade old. By cross-referencing the origin accounts against old arrest warrants for wire fraud, he explained he had finally cracked through the fake identity. Sutton Crane did not exist. It was an alias constructed 4 years ago. His real name was Derek Fallow. He was a convicted con artist who had already served 3 hard years in a medium-security state penitentiary for masterminding a large-scale real estate scam that preyed specifically on vulnerable elderly widows. He had a documented history of financial predation. My chest tightened. The man sleeping next to my daughter was a convicted felon. But Beckett wasn't finished. His fingers moved across the keyboard again, faster now. He opened a separate browser window and accessed a tightly restricted public records database. He typed the real name Derek Fallow alongside the name Claudia Fallow, cross-referencing past residential addresses and known associates. A progress bar crawled across the screen, stretching the silence in the small, airless car into something almost unbearable. Then, without warning, a high-resolution, scanned document appeared on the monitor, an official state record bearing a raised seal and a row of distinct signatures. Beckett downloaded the file and opened it to full screen. He stared at it for a long, weighted moment. He closed his eyes slowly, drew a deep breath, and then slammed his silver laptop shut with sudden, violent force. The crack of it echoed through the car like a shot. He turned and looked at me directly. His voice had nothing in it, no warmth, no softening, just cold finality. He told me to brace myself. He set his right hand flat on the lid of the closed laptop and spoke in a low, quiet voice the words that would mark the beginning of the total, irreversible unraveling of my daughter's carefully constructed world. "Gerald," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly pitch, "they are not brother and sister." I stared at Beckett, the damp chill of the Charleston evening gone, replaced by a spreading numbness deep in my chest. I asked him to say it again. Beckett didn't repeat himself. Instead, he opened the laptop and expanded the scanned document until the text filled the screen. I leaned across the console and read the heavily watermarked page. It was a marriage certificate issued in Clark County, Nevada. The date stamped at the top showed it had been filed exactly 8 years ago. My eyes dropped to the signatures at the bottom. The first belonged to Derek Fallow, the convicted felon I had known as Sutton Crane. The second belonged to Claudia Fallow, the woman currently occupying my daughter's guest room, eating at our table and playing the role of his warm, devoted older sister. They were not siblings. They were legally married husband and wife. The depravity of it hit me like something physical. My mind snapped back to the country club brunch, to the image that had sickened me then and sickened me worse now, Claudia dragging her bare foot along Sutton's thigh beneath the white tablecloth, while my beautiful, drugged daughter sat directly across from them. Beckett kept his voice low and deliberate, dissecting the situation with the calm precision of a man who had seen the worst of human behavior and catalogued it. What we were looking at, he said, was a highly organized, deeply seasoned grifter team. He pulled up a secondary file that laid out a pattern of conduct that made the cold in my chest spread further. This was their modus operandi. They hunted for wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women, women who were isolated or grieving, women who were starving for love and stability. Sutton would assume a meticulously built false identity, playing the perfect, charming suitor. He would overwhelm the target with lavish attention and fabricated wealth. Meanwhile, Claudia would embed herself in the picture as the protective but welcoming sister, offering a counterfeit sense of family to complete the illusion. Once the trap was fully set, and the victim had been quietly cut off from everyone who genuinely loved her, they would strike with absolute remorseless precision. But this time, Beckett set his eyes dark and level. The stakes were a different order of magnitude entirely. Nora was not simply a wealthy woman with a comfortable savings account. Nora was the sole heir to a commercial real estate empire I had spent 4 decades building from bare ground. And more critically, she was days away from being bound to a freshly written $10 million life insurance policy. They weren't planning to drain her accounts, take my properties, and disappear. They were planning to steal my entire legacy and then kill my only child in the frozen mountains of Switzerland to collect the ultimate payout. I sank back against the stiff seat fabric, struggling to pull a full breath into my lungs. My whole career had been built on understanding stress loads, tracing failure points, and driving steel into foundations until they held. I knew how to make buildings stand through hurricanes and earthquakes, but none of that training had readied me for the moment my own family began to fall apart from within. The predators were already inside. They were living beneath Nora's roof, quietly poisoning her mind and body with whatever toxic blend they'd been folding into her daily routine. I pressed my eyes shut, fighting down a sudden, crushing wave of tears. I couldn't cry. I couldn't spend what little I had on grief or panic. Nora needed an engineer right now. She needed a father who could construct a trap so airtight and so devastating that these parasites would never breathe free air again. Beckett cut into my thoughts, asking how we should move forward. He proposed taking the newly uncovered marriage certificate directly to local law enforcement, hoping they could pick up Sutton on outstanding warrants or parole violations filed under his real name. I shook my head, my jaw locked with absolute determination. I told Beckett that an arrest on an old wire fraud charge would put Derek Fallow away for only a few months at most. Claudia would post his bail, and the two of them would vanish, completely gone forever. Before I could guarantee Nora's safety, I needed them to answer for attempted murder. I needed to expose their living, breathing conspiracy in a way that left no legal daylight for maneuvering or soft plea deals. I told Beckett we were holding to the original plan. We had to let them walk straight into the snare at the rehearsal dinner. I had barely finished speaking when my cell phone erupted with a sharp vibration. It buzzed hard in the cup holder between our seats. I snatched it up, my hands trembling as I stared at the lit screen. It was a text from Nora. Just seeing her name put a knot in my throat. I unlocked the phone and pulled up the message, bracing for a short update, or maybe another flare-up from our earlier fight. What I read instead turned the blood in my veins to ice. Nora had written, "Pre says my vitamins are making me dizzy, so we are moving the Swiss Alps trip up by 2 days. We leave right after the reception." I read the text again, and then a third time, my eyes drilling into those glowing white letters. Sutton was speeding up the clock. He could see that the heavy sedatives and beta blockers he'd been feeding her were leaving marks. She was growing dangerously frail, maybe too weak to hold herself upright through a long wedding reception. Or perhaps he had caught something in my manner at the brunch and understood that his window of safe operation was closing fast. Whatever his thinking, he'd panicked. He was steering her out of the country the moment the reception ended, completely cutting out the 2-day buffer we had built our plan around. He was pulling her off American soil, away from my reach, away from U.S. law, faster than I'd counted on. I passed the phone to Beckett. He read it without a word, his jaw going tight. He looked over at me, and his expression confirmed the terrifying truth of what we were now facing. Our window for a counterattack had just been slammed shut by 48 hours. We no longer had the time to properly coordinate our evidence with the authorities. We were running on a razor-thin, brutally compressed schedule. The rehearsal dinner was no longer simply the final piece of the trap. It was the hard deadline. If I didn't stop them there, if I executed even one step of the plan wrong, Nora would be on a private jet to Europe before midnight, and I would never hold my daughter again. I drew a deep, shaking breath, the cold Charleston air filling my chest. I turned the key, and the engine came to life with a heavy roar. I pulled the rental car into drive. I had fewer than 72 hours to bring her home. That countdown beat inside my skull like a second pulse. There was no room to sit with the nauseating reality of that marriage certificate or the full scope of their betrayal. I looked at Beckett in the cold car and told him we had to be back in Texas before sundown. We left the Charleston strip mall behind and drove to the private airfield. The flight to Houston was suffocatingly quiet. I ran the penthouse layout through my mind over and over. I paced through the blind spots, mentally mapping every angle. I was no longer simply a furious father trying to shield his daughter. I was an engineer taking apart a hostile structure from the inside. The moment the wheels met the tarmac in Texas, Beckett opened his laptop and pulled up the cellular tracking software he used to hunt financial fugitives. Within minutes, he confirmed that Sutton and Nora were across town at a bakery for a final cake tasting. Claudia was checked in at a bridal boutique collecting last-minute alterations. The penthouse was sitting empty, but the window was frighteningly narrow. I left Beckett parked 2 blocks from the luxury high-rise and walked toward the building with my chin down. I skipped the main lobby, entirely slipping through the underground service entrance I still remembered from the original construction blueprints. I stepped into the freight elevator and rode it up to the penthouse level, my heartbeat hammering a steady drum against my ribs. When the heavy metal doors parted, I moved out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. I stood in front of the massive oak door of their apartment. Sutton had made a point of boasting about his military-grade smart lock system. To a structural engineer who had spent decades designing commercial security access points, it was nothing more than a puzzle asking to be solved. I crouched down and studied the digital keypad and the mechanical tumbler beneath it. I drew a small tension wrench and bypass probe from my pocket. I worked the probe into the narrow maintenance gap beneath the housing, feeling for the magnetic catch. With one slow, deliberate turn of my wrist, I interrupted the current just long enough to release the deadbolt. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, yielding sigh. I stepped inside and eased it shut behind me without a sound. The apartment carried the scent of cedar candles and something like impending doom. I didn't spare a glance at the wedding gifts stacked in the living room. I crossed the floor in long, silent strides, moving straight for the master suite and the room Sutton had claimed as his private home office. I turned the handle and pushed inside. The space was immaculately arranged, projecting the false image of a supremely successful executive. I worked through it methodically. Drawers, filing cabinets, the false bottoms of the desk, nothing. Sutton was a convicted con artist. He would never leave his most dangerous secrets in an ordinary drawer. He needed a concealed, secure anchor point. I stepped back and read the room the way a builder reads a structure. I calculated the square footage, measuring the interior dimensions against what the hallway outside implied. Something didn't line up. The wall behind his mahogany desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than the architectural standard required. I moved around the desk and pressed my palms flat against the smooth drywall. I wrapped my knuckles across the surface. About 3 feet up from the floor, the sound shifted from a hollow resonance to a flat, dense thud. I ran my fingers along the baseboard and found a seam that was nearly invisible. I pressed firmly against the panel's edge, and a small section of wall popped outward on a hidden spring hinge. Behind it sat a heavy fireproof steel safe. It had a mechanical combination dial, not a digital keypad. My breath went shallow as I knelt in front of it. Cracking a mechanical safe demands total silence and a precise feel for friction mechanics. I pressed my ear flat against the cold steel door and closed my eyes to strip away every other sound. I gripped the dial and began turning it with agonizing care. I listened for the faint metallic clicks of the internal tumblers dropping into position, a game of pure touch, feeling the slight drag of the locking mechanism as it caught each pin. The first number landed with a solid click. I reversed direction, sensing the exact moment the second pin engaged. I turned the dial one last time to the right. The third click rang out loud in my own ears. I pulled the heavy handle down, and the steel door swung open, exposing the dark interior. I reached in and lifted out a small black plastic tray. Resting at its center was a cheap disposable burner phone, but it was the object sitting right beside it that turned my blood to ice. It was a standard amber prescription bottle with no pharmacy label, just a strip of white masking tape wrapped around the plastic. Written on it in plain letters, Nora's Supplements. I unscrewed the child-proof cap with shaking fingers. Inside sat a collection of heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These were not vitamins. These were chemical shackles binding my daughter to the man who intended to kill her. I quickly tilted the bottle, stealing exactly 2 of the blue pills and tucking them deep into my breast pocket for toxicological testing. I screwed the cap back on and set the bottle precisely where I'd found it. Then a sharp sound tore through the silence of the apartment. The private elevator chimed up through the penthouse. Panic ignited in my chest like a flare. They were back ahead of schedule. I shoved the plastic tray back into the safe, drove the heavy steel door shut, and kicked the hidden wall panel back flush. I hauled myself upright, my heart slamming against my sternum. I could hear the front door coming unlocked. Sutton's smooth voice drifted in from the entryway. I bolted out of the office and moved silently down the short hallway, diving into the emergency fire stairwell a fraction of a second before Sutton rounded the corner into the living area. I eased the heavy fire door shut behind me, leaving a crack of less than half an inch. I went perfectly still, back pressed flat against the wall. I could hear Sutton moving through the apartment. He went straight into his office. Then came the unmistakable pop of the hidden wall panel swinging open, followed by the rapid spin of the safe dial. A moment later, the distinct electronic tone of a phone powering on. The burner phone. I pressed my ear closer to the gap, straining to catch every syllable. Sutton's voice dropped to a hushed, strictly business register. I heard him confirm that the cake tasting had gone smoothly and that Nora was resting. Then came the words that nailed my worst nightmare to the wall. He spoke with the chilling detachment of someone reading from a checklist. He said, "The dosage is perfect. Her heart rate is dropping. It will look exactly like natural altitude sickness in the Alps." The heavy steel fire door felt like a slab of ice against my spine. I held my breath, tracking the muffled rhythm of his footsteps moving away. I waited until I caught the faint whisper of the living room rug beneath his feet, telling me he'd drifted back to the main area of the penthouse. I slipped out of the emergency stairwell and rode the maintenance elevator down to the basement parking garage, my mind running at a ferocious, terrible clarity. I pushed through the exit doors and walked fast toward the rental car where Beckett sat waiting. I dropped into the passenger seat, fished the stolen blue capsules from my pocket, and set them on the center console. I told Beckett every word I'd heard through that crack in the door. I repeated Sutton's cold assessment, altitude, sickness, perfect dosage. Beckett didn't register even a flicker of surprise. He put the car in drive, his face locked in hard concentration, and told me we were heading to a private laboratory he trusted on the north side of the city. We needed absolute confirmation before our next move. The drive across town felt like moving through a waking nightmare. Every red light was a theft, precious seconds drained from my daughter's shrinking timeline. We pulled up to a plain concrete building tucked into a quiet commercial park. The lettering on the glass door read Meridian Analytical Group. Beckett walked straight past the reception desk, leading me down a bright, sterile corridor toward the rear testing facilities. He shouldered open a swinging door and introduced me to Dr. Aldous Corvin, an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Beckett a professional favor. Dr. Corvin was a quiet man with tired eyes and a clean white coat. He asked no unnecessary questions about where the unmarked pills had come from, or why a former investigator was bringing them through his back door. He simply took the capsules, placed them in a sterilized tray, and told us mass spectrometry analysis would take exactly 3 hours. He pointed us toward a small, windowless waiting room down the hall. Those 3 hours were the longest of my life. I wore a track across the floor, the rhythmic fall of my boots measuring out the agonizing minutes. I kept seeing Nora, her pale skin, her hollow eyes. Then the heavy door clicked open. Dr. Corvin walked in, carrying a thick stack of printed analytical reports. His expression was grim, the look a physician puts on, right before delivering a terminal diagnosis. He handed the top sheet to Beckett, but kept his eyes on me. He stated plainly that the blue capsules were not nutritional supplements, vitamins, or benign herbal remedies. They were a highly concentrated, lethal pharmaceutical cocktail. He broke down the chemistry with terrifying precision. The primary ingredient was a massive dose of a powerful prescription beta blocker engineered to artificially suppress the heart rate and drive blood pressure to dangerously low levels. The secondary compound was a heavy, fast-acting hypnotic sedative. Dr. Corvin set the paperwork on the table and walked us through the deadly synergy of the combination. At sea level, a healthy person taking these pills would suffer extreme fatigue, lethargy, and a severe crash in blood pressure. It would pass for deep viral exhaustion. But if that same person took this precise cocktail while ascending rapidly to the extreme altitude of the Swiss Alps, the physiological consequences would be catastrophic. The thin mountain air would force the heart to work harder just to survive. The beta blockers would forcibly prevent it from doing so. The resulting cardiovascular conflict would trigger a massive, instantaneous cardiac arrest. It was a flawlessly engineered, untraceable method of execution. It would look exactly like a tragic natural death from severe altitude sickness. The toxicologist's words struck me with the force of a wrecking ball. The room tilted. A primal rage detonated in my chest, blowing apart the cold, analytical control I had held onto. This was premeditated murder. Sutton and Claudia were actively managing my daughter's chemical deterioration, conditioning her body for a lonely death on a freezing mountain. All to collect a $10 million payout and seize my life's work. A sound came out of me, guttural, foreign to my own ears. I grabbed the edge of the metal table knuckles, going bone white, and sent it crashing across the room. It smashed into the drywall with a deafening impact. I spun toward the exit, my vision drowning in red. Plans, evidence, authorities, none of it existed anymore. I was going to drive straight back to the penthouse, kick that oak door off its hinges, and take Sutton apart with my bare hands. I reached the door handle, every muscle coiled and loaded. Beckett moved before I could turn the knob. He threw his body against the door, cutting off my exit. I grabbed his shirt to fling him aside. He didn't budge. He seized my shoulders and drove me hard into the wall, holding me there with surprising force. He stared straight into my eyes. His voice came out like a blade, sharp, cutting clean through the noise of my rage. He told me to stop acting like a reckless fool. He said that if I walked into that penthouse today and killed Sutton, I would rot in a prison cell for the rest of my life. And worse, Claudia would melt into the shadows, claim the hidden assets, and slip free of any justice. Nora would be left alone, traumatized and exposed to whatever remained of their criminal network. Beckett's grip tightened. His voice dropped lower, shifting into something cold and razor-sharp. He told me we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and in full public view. We had to spring the trap using the cage they'd built out of their own arrogance and expose their monstrous scheme in front of every person they'd manipulated. Only then would Nora be truly safe. I let go of his shirt. The red fury pulled back, replaced by a deep, dark reservoir of calculated hatred. I nodded, breathing hard, and agreed to his terms. I smoothed my jacket and forced the engineer back to the surface. Beckett stepped away and straightened his collar. Crisis averted. He opened his laptop. He told me that while Dr. Corvin had been running the analysis, he'd been running a deep, algorithmic background check on Derek Fallow's history, targeting unresolved police reports, suspicious accidental deaths, and large life insurance payouts tied to aliases used over the past 10 years. He said the marriage certificate in Charleston was only the beginning. What he'd found was a horrifying pattern of systemic calculated predation. Beckett turned the laptop so the screen faced me. He pulled up a scanned newspaper clipping from a Florida publication dated exactly 2 years ago. The headline announced the sudden death of a wealthy heiress during a private yachting trip. He slapped his hand flat on the table, his finger driving down at the grainy photograph of the grieving widower featured in the article. I leaned in toward the lit screen, its stark blue glow catching the glossy surface and throwing long, haunting shadows across the cramped interior of our rental car. The headline practically screamed at me from the digital archive, bold black letters searing themselves into my retinas. It read, "Wealthy heiress drowns on honeymoon in Fort Lauderdale. Husband survives tragic accident." What I'm about to share with you is the moment the full weight of what I was dealing with finally became undeniable, and it changed every decision I made from that point forward. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against your family this whole time, would you confront them immediately? Or would you go silent and start building your case? I studied the grainy black and white photograph positioned just below the headline. The man in the frame was standing on a wooden dock face buried in his hands in a flawless theatrical display of grief for the news cameras. He was younger, his hair styled a little differently, but the hard angles of his jaw and the cold, predatory set of his shoulders were unmistakable. It was Sutton. Or rather, it was Derek Fallow perfecting his deadly craft 2 years before he ever set eyes on my daughter. Beckett read the details of the police report aloud, his voice flat, clinical, stripped of any emotion. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who had recently inherited a substantial trust fund from her late father. They had been married less than a month. During a private yacht charter off the Florida coast, she supposedly slipped on a wet deck and went overboard in rough, unpredictable waters late at night. By the time the Coast Guard arrived and launched a search and rescue operation, it was far too late. The autopsy turned up heavy traces of powerful prescription sleep aids in her system, but her new husband calmly explained to investigators that she had been battling severe anxiety and debilitating insomnia in the lead-up to the wedding. Local authorities ultimately ruled it a tragic accidental drowning. Sutton walked away a grieving widower fully cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. He also walked away with an uncontested life insurance payout of exactly $5 million wired directly into his private accounts. The sheer horror of his history washed over me, but the blinding red fury that had nearly swallowed me whole just minutes earlier in the laboratory was completely gone. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity locked onto my mind. I was no longer dealing with a greedy con artist chasing an easy, unearned payday. I was dealing with a highly practiced, methodical serial killer. He had done this before, walked away clean, and was actively refining his process to guarantee he would never be caught. Nora was simply his next target, a far larger payout requiring a slightly more sophisticated execution in the thin air of the Swiss Alps, rather than the warm waters off Fort Lauderdale. But a serial killer, however polished and experienced, is fundamentally arrogant. Sutton believed he was the smartest person in every room he entered. He was certain he had already secured his victory. He looked at me and saw a grieving, obsolete old man he could brush aside without a second thought. He had no idea he had just picked a fight with a master builder. An engineer doesn't panic when he finds a fatal structural flaw in a building. He studies the schematics, calculates the precise loads, and engineers a permanent solution to neutralize the threat. My daughter's life was the ultimate structure, and I was going to reinforce its fragile foundation with an iron cage of irrefutable evidence. I was going to build a trap so methodically constructed, so airtight from every conceivable angle, that Sutton would never see open sky again. I told Beckett to print every page of the Florida police report and package it carefully alongside the toxicologist's lethal chemical analysis. I grabbed my phone and dialed the personal number for Clifford Odom. Clifford had been my trusted personal estate attorney for over 25 years, a razor-sharp legal mind who had guided me through the intricate zoning laws and large-scale corporate acquisitions that built my commercial real estate empire. I told him it was a matter of life and death and demanded he meet me at his private office in downtown Houston immediately. The long flight back to Texas was a blur of cold, relentless strategy. I walked into Clifford's mahogany-paneled office just as the morning sun was beginning to climb over the city skyline. I didn't waste a breath on pleasantries or small talk. I dropped the thick manila folder Beckett had assembled directly onto the center of his polished desk. But before Clifford could even reach for the criminal background checks or the chemical reports, I pulled a separate document from my inside jacket pocket, crisp, precise, unmistakable. It was the medical power of Attorney Sutton had practically thrust in my face during our confrontation at the penthouse. I told Clifford that Sutton had insisted this document was standard procedure designed to protect Nora's assets and ensure her medical care in the event of some unforeseen emergency. I demanded Clifford read every single line, every buried clause, and every obscure footnote buried in the legal language. He adjusted his glasses and began working through it methodically. The room was completely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the dry rustle of heavy paper. I watched his eyes sweep back and forth across the densely typed pages. His expression stayed professionally neutral through the first pages. But as he reached the third page, something shifted. The color began to drain from his face. His jaw loosened slightly, and a faint sheen of cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He went back over the final paragraph, tracing the small print with one finger, as though the words refused to settle into something believable. He set the document down slowly on the leather surface of the desk, and removed his glasses with a trembling hand. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with open, undisguised alarm. His voice was unsteady as he broke the silence. He told me this was not a standard medical proxy. It was an irrevocable, ironclad death warrant dressed in deceptive legal language. Clifford leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, and laid out the devastating reality. He said, "Gerald, if you allow Nora to sign this document, Sutton is granted absolute, uncontested medical authority over her life. If she suffers a cardiac event and goes into a coma on that mountain, he has the sole legal right to withdraw life support immediately. The document specifically strips you of all parental intervention rights. You will have absolutely zero say, and he will legally murder her while the doctors simply stand back and watch." The silence in Clifford's office was total. I looked at that piece of paper resting on the desk and felt a strange, paradoxical calm settle over me. A lesser man would have torn it apart on the spot. A terrified father would have called the police and forced a halt to the wedding. But I am an engineer. When you find a structural vulnerability in an enemy's stronghold, you don't seal the tunnel. You wire it with explosives and let them walk in. I looked Clifford straight in his pale, alarmed eyes and told him we were not going to block the medical power of attorney. He physically recoiled, reminding me that allowing Nora to sign it was signing her death warrant. I raised my hand to cut through his rising panic. I explained that Sutton was a careful, calculating predator who anticipated resistance. If I moved to block his legal trap, he would know immediately that his cover was blown. He would shut everything down, drain whatever accounts he could reach, and disappear before we had any chance to close in. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel the full, intoxicating rush of a completed victory. I instructed Clifford to draft a secondary, highly complex legal mechanism, a poison pill clause buried deep inside a separate trust fund document that Sutton would also be required to sign at the rehearsal dinner. This hidden clause would not only instantly nullify the medical power of attorney the moment his pen left the paper, but would simultaneously trigger a complete asset freeze on every account connected to his name. Clifford's breathing steadied as his legal mind wrapped around the sheer, devastating elegance of it. He gave a slow nod, a grim and determined smile, working its way across his face. He promised the clause would be completely invisible to anyone short of a seasoned trust attorney. I left Clifford typing furiously at his desk and drove straight to the heavily fortified federal building at the center of the city. I wasn't going to walk through a public entrance and file a generic complaint with some junior desk agent. I bypassed standard security protocols entirely and used a private phone number I had held onto for 15 years. I called Denton Grawl, the local field director for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 decades earlier, Denton had been a brilliant, fiercely driven young agent whose career was nearly derailed by a corrupt bureaucratic technicality. I had used my political influence and financial resources to make sure he was treated fairly quietly, funding a substantial legal defense that saved his career and allowed him to rise to his current position of considerable power. Denton owed me a life debt, and today I was finally collecting. Within 20 minutes, I was seated in his secure, soundproofed office. Denton welcomed me with a warm embrace, but his smile dropped the instant he read the cold, flat expression on my face. I opened my briefcase and spread the nightmare across his desk. I walked him through the toxicologist's certified report, laying out the lethal chemical cocktail of beta blockers and heavy sedatives Sutton was currently feeding my daughter. I presented Beckett's comprehensive algorithmic background check, exposing the fabricated Charleston family estate and unmasking Derek Fallow's true identity as a convicted felon. Then I slid the grainy black and white newspaper clipping from Florida across the table. Denton read the details of the previous wife's accidental drowning, his experienced eyes tracing the dark, deliberate pattern of a serial killer's methodology. The air in that secure room grew heavy. He leaned back in his chair and dragged a hand across his face. He told me this was a textbook predatory operation meticulously constructed. He confirmed Sutton was running a flawlessly executed long con, exploiting the jurisdictional gaps between state and international law to stay invisible. Denton then laid out the harsh reality of the federal justice system. Despite the substantial body of circumstantial evidence Beckett and I had assembled in Charleston, building a prosecution for premeditated murder before the crime actually occurred was enormously difficult. The Florida case had been closed as an accident, and a skilled defense attorney could explain away the toxicological evidence from the stolen pills as a pharmaceutical mix-up. Denton looked at me with hard, unwavering intensity. He said that to put Sutton in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, they needed to catch him committing a major, undeniable felony in real time. The FBI agreed to sanction a full undercover sting operation, but they required an airtight trigger. Denton explained that wire fraud and federal identity theft carried substantial mandatory minimum sentences. If Sutton knowingly signed fraudulent trust documents under his fabricated alias, fully intending to extort millions from a federally insured financial institution, the Bureau could move on the event immediately. The plan was brutally simple, yet extraordinarily dangerous. The rehearsal dinner would be ground zero. Federal agents would infiltrate the country club, posing as waitstaff, valet, and audiovisual technicians. Every inch of the private dining room would be covered by concealed high-definition cameras and directional microphones. But the entire operation rested on one solitary, fragile point of failure. Sutton had to physically pick up a pen and sign his false name on the dotted line. He had to feel completely safe, supremely confident, and utterly victorious at the precise moment he committed the fraud. If he sensed even the faintest hint of danger, if he detected a single crack in the environment, he would refuse to sign, and the entire federal trap would collapse on itself. The weight of that reality settled onto my shoulders, like a suffocating blanket of lead. I left the federal building and drove slowly toward my sprawling, empty home. The sun was beginning to sink below the Texas horizon, painting long, vivid streaks of orange and red across the evening sky. The rehearsal dinner was set to begin in less than 4 hours. I walked into my master bathroom and splashed ice-cold water over my exhausted face. I stared at my own reflection, watching the droplets run along the deep lines carved around my eyes. I had to walk into an elegant, crowded dining room and share a meal with the man who was plotting to kill my only child. I had to raise a champagne glass, deliver a warm and heartfelt speech, and look directly into the cold eyes of a serial killer without betraying a single trace of the volcanic fury churning inside my chest. If my smile wavered for even a moment, if my hands shook, if my voice carried the slightest edge of contempt, Sutton would spook and run. I straightened my silk tie, buried the terrified father somewhere deep, and brought the calculating engineer back to the surface. I turned away from the mirror and walked out the door. The drive from my silent estate to the grand ballroom of the 5-star hotel in downtown Houston took exactly 45 minutes. I used every second of that drive to smother my rage under a thick, impenetrable layer of projected surrender. I handed my keys to the valet, making sure my shoulders were visibly slumped and my stride was slow and heavy. I moved through the towering glass entrance and into the lavishly decorated foyer. The rehearsal dinner was a spectacular display of manufactured elegance paid for entirely out of my own accounts. 175 of the most elite influential citizens in the city filled the room, prominent developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites, all dressed in their finest evening attire. They mingled over expensive champagne, exchanging pleasantries, entirely unaware that they were bit players in a meticulously staged theater of deception. I paused at the arched entrance to the ballroom and drew a slow breath to anchor my racing pulse. I let my face settle into a mask of complete emotional depletion. I was no longer the commanding engineer who raised skyscrapers from bare ground. Tonight I was simply a tired, beaten old man who had finally stopped fighting the tide. I drifted through the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, offering thin, courteous smiles to colleagues and business partners along the way. The soft swell of classical music and quiet conversation filled the enormous room. Before I could reach the private head table, a smooth and deeply familiar voice cut through it all. Sutton appeared from the crowd in a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his athletic frame without a crease. He stepped directly into my path, wearing a broad, generous smile. It was the radiant, deeply unsettling smile of a predator who believes he has already finished his meal. He took my hand in a firm, dominant grip, his other hand coming up to clap my shoulder with deliberate force. He thanked me loudly for attending, projecting the image of a gracious and forgiving son-in-law for the benefit of everyone within earshot. Then he leaned in close, his breath warm at my ear, and murmured quietly that he was glad I had decided to be reasonable. He smelled of expensive cologne and pure, undiluted arrogance. I swallowed my revulsion and let my eyes drop in a show of complete submission. I told him softly that all I wanted was for my daughter to be happy. As Sutton released my hand, Claudia glided over her movements, smooth and practiced. She wore a stunning emerald evening gown that drew the eyes of half the room. She carried 2 crystal flutes of bubbling champagne, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a barely concealed, ravenous gleam. She extended a manicured hand and offered me a glass with a polished expression of familial warmth. She said how thrilled they were to be joining our families tonight. Her voice laced with manufactured sweetness. I accepted the delicate flute, my fingers briefly touching hers. I knew exactly what I was looking at. She was not a welcoming future in-law drawing me into her circle. She was the calculating wife of a convicted felon, a willing accomplice to serial murder, eagerly awaiting her enormous financial reward. I forced a polite nod, thanked her for her supposed warmth, and raised the glass to my lips without letting a single drop pass my teeth. I set the untouched champagne on the tray of a passing waiter. I shifted my attention away from the two of them and found the center of the grand head table. My heart broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. Nora was seated quietly in a high-backed velvet chair, utterly adrift in the middle of the swirling celebration. The physical damage from the lethal pharmaceutical cocktail was devastating to witness. My beautiful, vibrant daughter looked like a pale ghost of who she had been. Her eyes, usually bright and expressive, were sunken and dull, ringed by deep, bruised shadows. Her skin had taken on a frightening, translucent pallor, completely drained of healthy color. She was visibly trembling, her slender hands gripping the edge of the heavy table just to hold herself upright. She looked lost inside a suffocating chemical haze that was keeping her from sensing the danger closing in around her. Every instinct screamed at me to push through the crowd, pull her from that chair, and carry her out of the building. But a subtle movement at the edge of my vision stopped me cold. A tall man dressed as a catering captain reached up and adjusted his earpiece. Near the back wall, a technician handling the ambient lighting quietly repositioned a concealed camera lens. Denton and his federal agents were fully in position, invisible to any untrained eye. The trap was armed and waiting. I had to hold my ground. I walked to the head table and settled into my designated seat beside my daughter. Nora turned her head slowly, her movements heavy and poorly coordinated. She gave me a faint, trembling smile and whispered that she was glad I was there. I wrapped my hand gently around her cold, clammy fingers, making a silent promise that the nightmare was nearly finished. The lavish, multi-course dinner commenced a procession of exquisite dishes that tasted like ash in my mouth. The assembled guests laughed and drank freely, entirely blind to the lethal stakes unfolding at the front of the room. Sutton held court, dazzling the table with invented stories of generational wealth and corporate achievement. He played the devoted partner without a single missed beat, leaning over periodically to press his lips to Nora's pale cheek or murmur false reassurances into her ear. Every tender gesture was a calculated move to reinforce his perfect alibi. I sat quietly beside them, eating nothing, my gaze anchored to the white tablecloth. I performed the role of the broken, sidelined father with iron discipline. I let the minutes bleed into hours, waiting with the cold patience of a sniper for the moment the target stepped into the crosshairs. As the final dessert plates were cleared by the undercover federal agents, the ambient noise in the ballroom began naturally to subside. Sutton rose from his chair with easy elegance, a fresh glass of champagne raised in his right hand. He struck his silver spoon against the crystal rim. The chime instantly commanded the room. 175 influential guests fell silent, turning their expectant faces toward the head table. Sutton smiled broadly, his charismatic gaze sweeping the gathered crowd before coming to rest squarely on me. He spoke in a booming, theatrical voice that carried to the high ceilings. He announced that before the dancing began, my wonderful father-in-law had a special and meaningful gift to formally present to the new couple, the signing of the family trust. Sutton reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He slid the lethal medical power of attorney and a heavy gold pen slowly across the polished wood toward my waiting hands. The entire room looked on in absolute silence. The pen felt cold and oddly foreign against the rough calluses of my aging fingers. I lifted it slowly, turning it over, as though weighing the metal itself. The room stayed suspended in a breathless, expectant hush. 175 influential pairs of eyes were fixed entirely on me, waiting for the defeated patriarch to sign away his empire and step into the shadows. I looked up from the leather-bound portfolio and shifted my gaze to my daughter. Nora was listing sideways in her velvet chair, eyelids fluttering as she fought a losing battle against the heavy dose of sedatives coursing through her bloodstream. She had no awareness whatsoever that the document in front of me was a legally binding death warrant, designed to orchestrate her murder on a freezing European mountain. I pulled my gaze from her pale, fragile face and fixed it on Sutton. He was leaning forward over the tablecloth, his immaculate posture barely masking a primal, predatory hunger. He was practically salivating, his dark eyes tracking the gold pen in my hand with an intense, consuming greed. He was certain he had anticipated every variable, exploiting my parental love to guarantee his $10 million payout. Claudia sat beside him, mirroring his poorly concealed anticipation. Her fingers wound tightly around the stem of her champagne flute. They were waiting for the final stroke of ink that would seal their victory. I let the silence stretch for another agonizing moment, holding their gaze behind a perfectly blank expression. I didn't rush. I allowed the heavy, suffocating pressure of the room to build until it felt almost physical. Then I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply across the polished marble floor. I rose to my full height, straightened my shoulders, and shed the meticulously constructed illusion of the tired, broken old man. I reached across the table and drew the slender silver stem of the floral centerpiece microphone closer to my lips. I knew Denton and his entire team of undercover federal agents were monitoring through their hidden earpieces, poised for the precise audio trigger to launch the sting. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic sound rang out like a gavel striking a block across the enormous ballroom. The elite guests shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing a sudden and inexplicable change in the air. I scanned the crowd, then brought my eyes back to Sutton, locking onto him with the cold, precise focus of a master architect examining a critical structural failure. I spoke in a deep, resonant voice that reached every corner of the room. 40 years ago, I built my first skyscraper. I let that statement settle over the audience like a stone dropped into still water. I explained that the foundational rule of commercial engineering is deceptively simple. You can source the most expensive materials available. You can bring in the most gifted designers, and you can polish the exterior glass until it catches the light like a cut diamond. But if the foundational concrete is poured over unstable soil, the entire structure is already doomed from beneath. I kept my eyes on Sutton as I continued. A structure raised on a lie will always buckle under the weight of its own deception. A subtle, dangerous shift moved across Sutton's carefully maintained expression. The smug, triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a tight, barely visible clench of his jaw. He had recognized the change in my register. The threat buried inside my architectural metaphor was not lost on a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing elaborate illusions to ensnare vulnerable women. He flicked a quick glance toward the exit doors, his survival instincts finally beginning to sound their alarm. I refused to release his gaze, pressing harder, with my voice allowing the volcanic fury I had suppressed all evening to finally bleed into my carefully measured words. I told the captivated room that a family is precisely like a great steel structure. It demands unshakable honesty, complete transparency, and a foundation formed in genuine love to endure the hard storms that life brings. When parasites burrow into that structure, when they systematically hollow out the load-bearing walls and replace solid steel with toxic manipulation, the building becomes a lethal danger to everyone sheltered inside. I lifted the gold pen into the air, presenting it to the silent crowd, like a piece of criminal evidence entered into the record. I stated that the document resting on that table was not a standard trust agreement crafted to protect my daughter. I declared it was a sophisticated, precisely engineered trap, drawn up by a man who had mastered the art of predatory destruction long before he ever set foot in the state of Texas. A low wave of bewildered murmuring moved through the ballroom. The wealthy guests traded confused glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing some strange, scripted element of the rehearsal entertainment or a catastrophic public unraveling. Claudia was the first to break. She lurched upright from her chair, her emerald evening gown rustling sharply against the fabric. Her face contorted with furious indignation. She moved to interrupt, raising her voice to proclaim that the emotional strain of the wedding had clearly pushed me into some kind of severe mental breakdown. She reached across the table, scrambling to seize the leather portfolio from my grasp. I drove my left hand down onto the document, pinning it to the table with a force that rattled the crystal glasses and cut her protests dead. I looked directly at Claudia, dropping the last remnant of my polite and socially presentable facade. I told her to sit down and stay silent before she came to deeply regret it. She went still, her eyes widening as she registered the pure menace radiating from my posture. I turned back to Sutton. All the color had left his face. He was edging his chair slowly backward, preparing to make for the nearest emergency exit. He knew the game was finished. He had walked straight into the trap, and the steel jaws were closing fast around his throat. I held the gold pen poised directly above the signature line of the lethal medical power of attorney. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the final decisive move. I looked at the man who had carefully planned to murder my only child on a freezing European mountain for a $10 million payout. I let myself smile, the kind that lets the wolf finally show its teeth. Then I simply let the pen go. It clattered against the polished wood and rolled away from the fraudulent document. I reached into my suit pocket and drew out my cellular phone. No more words. I locked eyes with Sutton, that wild, cornered look spreading across his face, and brought my thumb down on a single button. The entire ballroom went black in an instant. Every chandelier, every wall sconce, every ambient glow gone. That darkness hit the room like a physical force, a total collapse of the senses. For one suspended heartbeat, the only thing any of us could hear was 175 of the city's finest drawing breath at exactly the same moment. Without those glittering fixtures overhead, something oppressive settled over the white linen tables, a smothering, airless quiet. I didn't move. I stood rooted where I was, letting my eyes find whatever faint shapes the darkness allowed. Around me, silk rustled nervously, leather soles scraped against cool marble, small sounds that filled the void. Then Sutton, right beside me, exhaled through his nose. A dismissive little huff. He said something low and contemptuous about a tripped breaker or the hotel staff botching the electronics. He genuinely thought he still held the wheel. In his mind, this was a minor technical embarrassment, an unwanted pause in his personal parade. He had not yet felt the ground shift beneath him. He didn't know I had already lit the fuse. That was when a slow, mechanical rumble started up near the ceiling at the far end of the room, the deep, churning vibration of a ceiling-mounted digital projector coming to life. A high-definition blade of white light tore through the black, passing clean over the heads of every bewildered guest and hitting the broad canvas screen hung behind the head table. The walls filled with long, warped shadows. A ripple of murmuring moved through the seated crowd. They turned expectantly toward the screen, sure they were about to see a sentimental reel, the happy couple's vacation photos, candlelit dinners, the carefully assembled mythology of a love story. What appeared instead stopped every breath in the room. Blown up so large that someone in the last seat of the farthest table could read every word without squinting, a legal document filled the screen, crisp black type on white, official and undeniable. The projector light swept across hundreds of upturned faces, catching every expression of mild, unsuspecting curiosity. It took 3 seconds. That was all it took. The document on that screen was the marriage certificate out of Clark County, Nevada. Derek Fallow and Claudia Fallow, those names, sat there in bold print above their own signatures, flanked by the government seal and a filing date from 8 years ago. From the center of the room, a single sharp gasp ignited, and then it spread a wave of stunned comprehension rolling outward through the crowd. Politicians, property magnates, the pillars of this city's high society, they sat as though bolted to their chairs, champagne glasses suspended mid-air, forgotten. The fiction of the devoted, warm-hearted older sister, the one who had smiled so graciously all evening, was being dismantled in 10-foot letters for every powerful person in that room to see. I turned my head toward Claudia. The projector's hard light hit her at a brutal angle. Her jaw had come unhinged. The blood was retreating from her face in real time, leaving her the color of old plaster. She had the look of something cornered under a floodlight, unable to move, unable to think. Across from her, Sutton rocketed out of his chair, knocking it clean off its legs behind him. He thrust his arm into the air and bellowed into the darkness. "Kill the power! It's a fabrication, someone is lying." But the voice that had always been so polished and persuasive was fraying, badly threaded through with something high-pitched and unmistakable. The control he had cultivated over years was fracturing in public, right here, right now. I kept my expression neutral and my hand easy in my pocket. My thumb found the button a second time and pressed it. The projector advanced with a hard click. The marriage certificate disappeared, and a split screen took its place. Left side, a blurry clipping from a Florida newspaper, covering the tragic, drowning death of a wealthy man on his honeymoon. Right side, the official autopsy report from the medical examiner's office with a highlighted section showing a substantial concentration of sleep agents in the dead man's system. The banner headline about the bereaved husband who had survived was pulled up large, and a clear graphic arrow ran from the name Derek Fallow in the police file straight to a sharp, unambiguous photograph of Sutton on that Fort Lauderdale dock taken 2 years ago. The low murmur in the room climbed fast, not whispers anymore, not confusion. Fear. These people were recalculating who they had broken bread with tonight. They were staring at a predator seated at the place of honor. The temperature in that room seemed to drop, weighed down by the reality of what they were seeing, a killing planned and executed. I noticed the real estate men leaning back in their chairs, pulling away from the head table as though proximity itself had become dangerous. Sutton had stopped making coherent demands. He was rotating on the spot, dragging both hands through his hair, his voice cracking as he screamed for management to kill the projector. The unflappable man who had walked in here tonight was gone, dismantled. What remained was pure, exposed panic. I pressed the button one last time. The screen changed again, and this was the killing strike. Dr. Aldous Corvin's certified toxicological report filled the display, cold clinical columns of chemical data, laying out the precise composition of a massive combined dose of beta blockers and hypnotic sedatives. Right alongside those lab results, a sharp, unambiguous photograph of blue capsules inside an amber bottle. The label read, "Nora's Supplements." Text beneath the image spelled out exactly how this compound had been formulated to trigger a massive cardiac arrest under the low oxygen conditions of high altitude, a death that would look to anyone without reason to look closer, like a tragic natural accident in the mountains. The room came apart. Chairs toppled as people lurched upright. Shouts of revulsion bounced off the vaulted ceiling. Women pressed hands to their mouths. Men shouted for someone to get the police on the phone. In the space of minutes, an elegant rehearsal dinner had become a crime scene in front of witnesses. But none of that was what mattered most to me. What mattered was happening in the chair to my left. The screaming, the harsh projector glare, the sheer electric panic saturating the air together. They punched through the chemical haze that had been wrapped around my daughter's mind all evening. That surge of raw adrenaline did what nothing else had managed. It cut the sedatives loose. Nora's head came up fast. She pulled air in shallow, rapid pulls. She planted both palms flat on the tabletop, the wood creaking under the pressure as she straightened herself in her chair. Slowly, her head swiveled toward the screen. Those exhausted, sunken eyes moved across the lines of the toxicologist's report and took in what they said. Every beautiful lie Sutton had wrapped around her life cracked open in that moment. She stopped looking at the screen and found the man she had been planning to stand beside at the altar. Sutton hadn't moved. He stood rigid at the head table, staring back at my daughter, and what he saw in her eyes was absolute terror aimed directly at him. He understood right then that he had stepped into something he could never walk back out of. There was no version of this where he still won. One suspended beat of silence gripped the grand ballroom, and then the weight of those images on the screen came down on the room like a collapsing ceiling. Claudia broke first. Every trace of the polished, affectionate sister figure burned away in an instant, and what surfaced in its place was the raw survival instinct of someone who knows the trap has closed. She shoved her velvet chair hard enough that it screeched across the marble, then ran straight for the swinging service doors that opened into the catering kitchen. Her emerald evening gown tore at the hem as her heels lost purchase on the polished stone. She had spotted what she thought was a gap. The dark service passages behind those doors, a path that wound down to the underground parking garage and out. She had not accounted for what I had built around this room while she was busy playing the devoted sister. Her hands hit those swinging doors hard, and something immovable was already on the other side. Beckett. He said nothing. He did not reach for any kind of official procedure. One large, rough hand closed on the fabric at her shoulder and wrenched her around with a momentum she had no answer for. Her back met the structural wall behind her with a thud that drove the air straight out of her. Beckett held her there, his expression locked into something cold and utterly professional, cutting off her escape before she had cleared the room by so much as a step. Around them, the assembled elite screamed and broke in every direction. I didn't spare Claudia a single look. My gaze never left Sutton. The moment full comprehension of his defeat landed, something horrifying happened to his face. The handsome magnetic exterior just dissolved, peeled back to expose the cold, calculating killer that had always been living beneath the tailored tuxedo. His jaw locked so hard, I half expected to hear his molars crack over the rising screams behind us. Every trace of the smooth, patient seducer who had so skillfully worked his way into my daughter's trust, gone. What remained was a caged predator, discovering too late that the cage door had already been welded shut. His eyes shot to the projector screen, still broadcasting his history, then dropped to the heavy gold pen sitting untouched on the tablecloth. Around the room, the federal agents embedded among the catering staff and technical crew were tightening the circle, cutting methodically through the fleeing crowd, with their hands riding near their concealed weapons. Sutton could feel the net closing from every direction, but something in the wiring of his psyche simply would not allow him to go quietly. A sound came out of him, feral, guttural, stripped of anything resembling rational thought or human feeling. He drove both palms into the tablecloth and vaulted clean over the head table, sending silver cutlery, crystal champagne flutes, and towering floral arrangements exploding across the marble floor. He came straight at me, fingers bent into tight, violent fists, intent on tearing me apart before anyone could reach him. One last savage act of retaliation. He expected me to stumble backward, He had spent the entire evening watching me play a frail, diminished old man, and he was counting on that performance being real. He was wrong on every count. I didn't flinch. My feet didn't move an inch. All evening, I had been leaning on a thick, solid oak walking cane, a deliberate prop carefully chosen to complete the picture of a man whose health was failing him. Sutton had written it off immediately as the sad accessory of someone past his prime. That was his final fatal miscalculation. The cane was not a prop. It was a precisely engineered instrument, dense-weighted, built for exactly this moment. As he closed the distance between us, his face a mask of blind, murderous fury. I shifted my weight, low-planted both feet, with the settled stability of someone who has spent decades understanding how structures hold under pressure. Both hands tightened around the polished brass handle hips, pivoted, and I drove the solid oak shaft with every ounce of force I had left in my body. I didn't aim for his chest or his head. I calculated the precise angle to stop him cold, to collapse his forward momentum entirely. The wood connected squarely with the side of his left kneecap. The sound it made was not a thud. It was a crack, sharp and structural, the kind that cuts right through crowd noise and lodges in your memory. The joint gave way completely beneath the force of the impact. Sutton's scream of rage transformed mid-cry into something else, a high, wretched shriek of pure pain as the leg folded under him and he went down hard. He hit the marble with his full weight, both hands clutching his destroyed knee as the undercover agents converged from every corner of the room. They flooded the front of the dining hall, voices commanding, directing panicked guests back and ordering Sutton to stay flat on the ground. Outside the tall windows, the red and blue strobes of multiple police units swept across the grand ballroom walls like a light show no one had planned. The mechanism had closed with absolute precision. But Sutton, even broken on that cold floor, surrounded on all sides by armed federal officers, could not let go of his arrogance. He craned his neck up toward me, face gray and twisted breath dragging through clenched teeth. He dredged up what was left of his sneer, reaching for the superiority that had always come so easily to him. Then he started talking. Loud, furious, desperate. He told me I had nothing. He said I was a deranged, paranoid old man who had just put hands on him in front of more than 100 witnesses. He jabbed a shaking finger at the dark leather portfolio still sitting undisturbed on the tablecloth above him. He hadn't signed it yet, he said, and without his signature on that document, no one could establish intent to commit federal wire fraud. Not legally. Not ever. He thought he had found the one hairline crack in the structure I had built. I lowered the cane slowly. I moved to the edge of the table, bent toward the silver floral microphone, and brought my face close enough that the whole room would hear every syllable. I looked straight down at what he had become, broken, bleeding, sprawled on the floor, and I delivered it quietly. No theatrics, no raised voice, just complete, certain truth. "Oh, but you did!" The microphone carried it through the entire ballroom. It hung in the air. Sutton's face cycled through agony and confusion, simultaneously, his chest lurching as he tried to pull enough breath to process what I had just said. He ground out a response through his teeth, demanded to know what I meant, insisted again that his name was on nothing, that no contract had been executed. I stepped around the scattered silver and broken crystal on the floor. I stood over him and began to dismantle the last wall he thought he had left, standing slowly, methodically, the way you walk a client through a structural report they don't want to hear. I acknowledged that he was correct about the family trust document on the table. He hadn't signed it. But his entire focus had been fixed on the wrong trap. Wire fraud and extortion were never what this was really about. Those charges were the scaffolding put in place to guarantee federal jurisdiction and lock down the prosecution. The foundation was something else entirely. I leaned back toward the microphone, making certain that every person still standing in that room, every guest, every operative, and my daughter heard what came next. Then I asked Sutton a single simple question. Did he honestly believe he had actually been poisoning Nora's vitamins over those last 72 hours? Whatever color remained in his face left it. His eyes snapped to Nora, who sat completely still in her chair, hands in her lap, listening to every word with a growing, dawning horror. I didn't give him a breath of time to construct an answer. I straightened up and let the full authority of what I had done fill the room. 3 days ago, while he and Claudia were consumed by their fraudulent wedding preparations, I had broken into the penthouse. I walked them through it, how I had bypassed the military-grade smart lock, neutralized his security cameras, and located the steel safe he had hidden behind false drywall in his private home office. I watched the expression on Sutton's face change. The pain was still there, but something larger swallowed it whole, pure, dawning terror at the scale of what he had missed. I described cracking the mechanical dial on his fireproof safe. Inside a cheap plastic tray. Inside that, an amber prescription bottle bearing my daughter's name. I had taken those blue capsules directly to a private independent toxicologist to verify exactly what they were. And then I had executed the most important phase of the entire counterattack. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had replaced every single one of his poisoned capsules with completely inert, harmless placebos. A wave of stunned silence moved through the room before the gasps broke it apart, socialites and politicians alike, confronting the full, undisguised reality of what had been planned for Nora. I kept going. The actual poison he had sourced to trigger a fatal cardiac event at altitude in the Swiss Alps was no longer anywhere in his possession. I had personally delivered the entire lethal compound to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the burner phone he had used to procure it. Federal forensic analysts had already pulled his digital fingerprints, his encrypted communications, and precise cellular location data from that device. Without realizing it, he had handed federal authorities a perfectly documented, self-incriminating record of everything he had intended to do. Nora let out a sharp, trembling breath. The thick mental fog that had dulled her senses for weeks was burning off fast, replaced by the raw, bone-deep terror of understanding exactly how close she had come to dying alone on a mountainside. She stared at the man she had loved, the man who had murmured promises of a beautiful future, while quietly measuring out a lethal dose of pharmaceutical poison. Sutton tried to drag himself backward across the marble, hauling his ruined knee behind him in a futile, pitiful attempt to escape the spotlight closing in around him. He was finished, a rat caught in a precision-engineered trap with no exits. Before Sutton could pull together one final desperate lie, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom blew open with a concussive bang, a thunderclap that tore through what remained of the room's tension. 12 heavily armed federal agents poured into the dining hall, their dark tactical gear cutting a jarring, violent contrast against the formal evening wear of the scattered guests. Field Director Denton Grawl led them straight down the center aisle, no hesitation, no theater, just absolute command. He leveled a finger at the bleeding man on the floor and ordered his team to take the primary suspect into custody. 2 large federal agents hauled Sutton up by his tuxedo jacket. He shrieked in raw, unfiltered agony as his shattered kneecap was forced to carry weight. They drove him face first into the polished mahogany of the head table and wrenched his arms hard behind his back. The metallic snap of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists rang through the silent room like a closing vault. Sutton thrashed against their grip, every trace of his former composure replaced by the frantic, graceless struggling of a man watching his entire constructed life crumble in real time. He screamed wild, incoherent threats aimed at no one in particular, as the irreversible destruction of everything he had built closed around him. At the same moment, a second tactical team moved on the service corridor near the catering kitchen. The swinging doors flew wide as Beckett marched Claudia back into the main ballroom. She came in fighting. Her emerald evening gown was torn at the hem, her immaculate hair pulled loose and disheveled. She was screaming, demanding a lawyer, twisting against the steel cuffs binding her wrists. The agents on either side of her gave her protests exactly no acknowledgement, steering her toward the main exit and lining her up beside the man she had helped destroy lives with. Both of them were walked out into the pulsing red and blue lights of the waiting cruisers. Their elaborate, lethal performance permanently over. I turned away from them and looked down at my daughter. Nora was shaking her pale hands, gripping the edges of the white tablecloth, as though the table itself was the only solid thing left in the world. The full weight of how close she had come to a lonely staged death had finally landed on her all at once. She broke. A ragged, heartbroken sob tore out of her, and she collapsed into my arms. I pulled her in and held on tight, complete unyielding, wrapping myself around my terrified, relieved, irreplaceable child. The chaos of the grand ballroom drained away, slowly settling into a stark, echoing emptiness. The wealthy guests who had arrived so eager to witness a celebration of achievement had long since fled into the cold night, leaving the room a wreck of overturned velvet chairs, shattered crystal and crushed floral arrangements, scattered across the marble like the aftermath of a silent battle. The heavy double doors stood propped open, and a cool draft moved through from the hotel lobby, gradually clearing the residue of expensive cologne and manufactured elegance from the air. A tight, focused team of agents worked the perimeter near the catering kitchen, bagging the fraudulent documents and tagging the tables as evidence. The strobing police lights had gone from the tall windows, replaced by the steady ambient glow of the city beyond, patient, indifferent, enduring. I stayed at the head table at the center of the wreckage with my suit jacket settled around Nora's trembling shoulders. Behind us, the ceiling-mounted projector had been powered down, and the canvas screen had returned to darkness. Nora rested her head against my chest, her breathing gradually finding its own rhythm as the last of the sedatives worked their way out of her system. The nightmare had been shut down completely and permanently. We were alone in that vast, ruined room, enclosed by the physical debris of a meticulously constructed deception. But the suffocating pressure that had lived in my chest for months was finally entirely gone. She shifted against me, both hands reaching up to take hold of my lapel. She lifted her face, searching mine with an expression that held gratitude and guilt in equal devastating measure. Tears moved silently down her cheeks, catching the faint light drifting in from the foyer. When she spoke, her voice was fragile, the words snagging in her throat. She said she was sorry. She kept saying it. Her face pressed back into my chest, crying for the beautiful lie she had wanted so badly to be true. She apologized for the last 6 months, for shutting me out, for dismissing every concern I raised, for calling me a jealous, controlling old man who couldn't bear to see her move forward. She told me that Sutton had worked on her, slowly, steadily planting the quiet, corrosive suggestion that I was trying to manage her inheritance and undermine her happiness. She asked through her sobs how she could have been so blind, how she could have looked every single day into the eyes of someone capable of that and seen only love. I stroked her hair and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Steady, unconditional, with no weight of anger or recrimination behind it. I kept my voice low, and even anchoring her to where we actually were right now. And I told her she had nothing, not one thing to apologize for. Predators like Sutton and Claudia did not choose their targets because those targets were naive or weak. They chose people like Nora precisely because she carried a kind, open, genuinely empathetic heart. They took the best of what she was and turned it into a blindfold, using her own goodness to block her view of what they actually were. I tilted her chin up until she was looking at me. From the moment I first held her in that delivery room, I told her my only function in this world has been to be her shield. A father doesn't set that down because his child feels safe. I would demolish every structure I ever built, reduce the entire fortune to nothing, and walk into the fire without hesitating as many times as it took to make sure she got to take her next breath. As I said it, I could feel the crushing load of the past 3 days lifting off my frame, watching understanding and relief settle into her exhausted face. She wrapped both arms around my neck and held on with a fierce, desperate strength, anchoring herself finally to the one person who had never once deceived her. We sat together in that silent, ruined ballroom for another hour, letting the adrenaline work its way out of our systems. Eventually, a federal agent came to the table, quietly letting us know our formal statements had been processed, and we were free to go home. I thanked him and meant it. I pushed myself up, slowly shifting my weight onto the oak cane, the adrenaline crash making itself known in every joint as my body reminded me it had taken a serious toll tonight. I reached my free hand out to Nora. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm and steady, stronger than I expected. We moved together through the debris of the rehearsal dinner, stepping past the shattered remnants of a deadly illusion, out through the grand arched entrance and into the hotel foyer. Our footsteps quiet against the polished marble. We left that dark chapter on the floor behind us where it belonged. Through the tall glass doors, we walked out into the cool night air of downtown Houston, both of us pulling in long, deep breaths that tasted unmistakably like freedom. The storm that had gathered over our family and threatened to swallow everything had broken. Above us, the sky had cleared, sharp, open, filled with stars. The fortune I had spent my life constructing was safe, insulated permanently from the reach of people who had mistaken patience for weakness and love for a vulnerability to exploit. The trust documents and the medical power of attorney had been seized as federal evidence destined for an evidence locker where they would remain. Sutton and Claudia were in separate federal interrogation rooms, staring at a mountain of physical evidence that left them nowhere left to go. Federal prosecutors were already putting together a sweeping indictment, attempted murder, interstate wire fraud, conspiracy charges, layered on top of one another. Both of them were facing the near-certain reality of dying inside the walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary, with parole never once entering the conversation. Their names would be scrubbed from everything that mattered, surviving only as a grim, cautionary footnote. I glanced over at my daughter while the valet pulled the car around to the front entrance. The ordeal had been savage, and it had taken something from her, that particular brand of innocence that doesn't grow back, but it had not touched the deeper thing, the part of her that was still entirely her own. What exists between a father and his daughter had been run through the most malicious, calculated evil either of us will ever encounter. And what came out the other side was harder and truer than anything that went in, tempered by the fire, not destroyed by it. We settled into the quiet of the waiting car, both of us ready finally to go home and begin building whatever came next. That was a full year ago. 1 year since that dark, spiraling night in downtown Houston, and the peace has settled back over our home like something earned rather than given. The federal trial ran with the cold, efficient momentum of a machine that had already made up its mind. Faced with the sheer mass of physical evidence, the certified toxicology reports from the independent lab, the recovered burner phones, the newly surfaced links connecting them to the Florida killing Sutton and Claudia, let their arrogant facades drop entirely. They both moved quickly toward plea agreements to keep the death penalty off the table. They will spend whatever years remain of their lives in the featureless sterility of a maximum security federal facility, and those walls will not open for either of them. 6 months after sentencing, They filed an appeal, a threadbare, desperate legal maneuver in which they claimed I had engineered the entire thing and fabricated the digital evidence out of nothing. The federal judge dismissed it, barely entertained it from what I was told. Nora came back to the family home for a stretch of months after that, quiet months, careful ones shaped entirely around recovery. The process was slow, and it required patience from both of us. I watched the chemical fog that had dimmed her mind for so long gradually burn away. The color found its way back into her cheeks, the real color, the living kind, erasing the translucent pallor that had lived in my nightmares for months. Today, her contemporary art gallery is doing better than it ever has. More clients, more energy, more genuine momentum than anything built on manipulation could have ever produced. Every Sunday morning, the two of us sit on the wide wooden porch together, holding mugs of strong coffee, talking about nothing important and everything that matters. I didn't just save my daughter's life that night. I got my closest friend back from the very edge of something permanent and irreversible. The emotional damage will take real time to fully resolve, that's simply the honest truth. But we are walking that road together side by side every single day. And neither of us is walking it alone. There is one more thing I need to mention, and it is something I carry with a specific personal weight. Enzo, the sharp, perceptive master tailor who steered me into that cramped fitting room at Enzo Battista's tailor shop and refused to let me leave until I had heard the truth, that man has not once paid for a drink or a hot meal anywhere in this city since that day. I personally made certain of that. It is a small gesture measured against what he gave me, but it is the right one, and I will keep making it. Here is what I have come to understand about the night that changed everything. Sometimes the universe places the thing that saves your life directly inside the thing that is trying to destroy it, packages a miracle so tightly inside a nightmare that you almost miss it while you are busy trying to survive. When that moment finds you, the worst thing you can do is panic. You go still. You listen. You map out the structure of what you are actually facing, and then you build your response with every tool and every ounce of intelligence at your disposal. To any parent who has recognized something in this story, any mother or father who has watched a new person enter their child's life and felt that cold, instinctive certainty that something is wrong, I want to speak to you directly. Do not let the fear of your child pulling away silence the alarm your gut is already sounding. Predators like the ones who came for Nora do not announce themselves. They do not arrive wearing anything that marks them as a threat. They come looking like exactly what your child has always needed, patient, devoted, charming in a way that feels almost too perfect. They use that charm as the weapon, and they use isolation as the mechanism that makes it impossible to fight back. If someone new enters your family's orbit, and the temperature changes if your once open, vibrant child starts to withdraw, turns suspicious of your motives, begins repeating ideas about you that don't sound like their own, do not step back and tell yourself it's none of your business. That is exactly what the predator is counting on. You dig. You ask the questions that make the room uncomfortable. You push past the resistance even when it costs you, even when your child looks at you with real anger in their eyes. Because here is the only math that matters. It is far better to spend a difficult month being seen as the controlling, unreasonable, paranoid parent than to spend the rest of your life knowing you stood down when it counted. Temporary estrangement is survivable. Grief for a preventable death is not something you ever fully come back from. A father's love, stubbornly, inconveniently, relentlessly protective, is not a weakness dressed up as devotion. It is the only shield that was always going to be strong enough. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I want to speak to you directly for just a moment before you go. I have spent a long time turning this over in my mind, what it cost, what it taught me, what I would do differently, and what I would do exactly the same. The honest answer is that I'd do all of it again without a second's hesitation. What I didn't expect was how much the experience would shake my certainty in my own judgment. I had built things my whole life, structures, systems. I trusted what I could measure and verify. But the truth is, some things can only be seen when you're willing to be still and listen. I believe God placed Enzo in that fitting room for a reason. The timing was too precise, the warning too clear to call it anything else. Here's what I carried out of that night, and what I'd want any parent, any person who loves someone to hold on to. Trust the quiet alarm. If something feels wrong about the person your child has given their heart to, that feeling is data. Don't dismiss it to keep the peace. Isolation is a tactic, not a phase. When someone you love suddenly stops being reachable, look closer at who is standing between you. Patience is not passivity. Build your case before you move. A premature confrontation hands the advantage to the predator. The most dangerous lies come wrapped in exactly what we most want to believe. Charm is not character. Time and pressure reveal the truth that charm conceals. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. A parent with a nagging worry they've been afraid to act on a friend who has watched a loved one change and doesn't know what to do. Leave a comment and tell me what you took from it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dad Revenge, there are more stories here, and every one of them is worth your time. Thank you for listening. You take good care of yourself and the people you love.